In 1563, the Council of Trent issued a decree that changed the rules of godparenthood. Before that decree, a child could have as many as 17 godparents. After it, the Church limited the number to 2.
One godfather. One godmother. No exceptions.
The official reason was simplicity. Too many godparents created confusion in canon law. But the historians who actually read the full proceedings of Trent note something the simplified version leaves out. The delegates did not debate theology when they discussed godparenthood. They debated property. They debated inheritance. They debated debt. Because before 1563, godparenthood was not a ceremony.
It was a contract.
I came to this research the same way most people stumble into history they were never supposed to find. Through a document that didn't make sense. My grandmother kept a wooden box of family papers. Inside was a land transfer record from rural Sicily, dated 1891. The transfer was not between family members. It was between a man and his child's godfather. The land moved in one direction. A debt was cancelled in the other. No bank was involved. No court recorded the transaction. 2 men stood before a local official, one of them holding an infant, and an obligation that had existed for 11 years was settled through a piece of farmland. I showed the document to a genealogist. She looked at it for 30 seconds and said, "That's a comar transaction." Perfectly normal for that period. I had never heard that word used that way.
Comar. Compadre. Compere. Commere.
The words exist in Italian, Spanish, French. They translate roughly as co-parent. But in their original legal usage, they described something more precise. A person who had entered into a binding economic relationship with your family at the moment of your baptism. A relationship that carried enforceable obligations for the rest of both parties' lives. This is not what we call a godparent today. Today a godparent attends a church ceremony, buys the child a silver cup, and is expected to send birthday cards. The modern godparent is a ceremonial role with sentimental weight and almost no legal substance. That transformation did not happen gradually. It happened in a specific period, through specific mechanisms, and the people who benefited from the old system fought hard to keep it. The Catholic Church formalized godparenthood at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The original purpose was theological. A godparent sponsored the child's entrance into the faith. They vouched for the family's orthodoxy. In an era when Christianity was still dangerous, the sponsor assumed real risk. If the family was accused of heresy, the godparent could be implicated alongside them. That theological function carried legal weight from the beginning. Because risk requires compensation. Because vouching for someone creates an obligation that runs in both directions. By the 8th century, the obligations had formalized. The Frankish Church under Charlemagne required godparents to teach their godchildren the Lord's Prayer and the Creed. This sounds purely religious until you understand the context. Literacy in the 8th century was almost exclusively ecclesiastical. A godparent who could teach a child to read those texts was a godparent with significant resources. The obligation to teach implied the obligation to house, to feed, to provide. Charlemagne's capitularies, the royal directives that enforced church law, explicitly linked godparenthood to responsibility for the child's material welfare if the parents died or became unable to care for them. This is an insurance system. It uses the language of spiritual kinship because that is the language the 8th century had available. But the mechanism is identical to what an actuary would design. You create a formal bond at the moment of maximum vulnerability. You attach enforceable obligations to that bond. You distribute the risk of catastrophe across a network larger than the nuclear family. And you do it without a bank. By the medieval period, the godparent relationship had accumulated layers of legal obligation that varied by region but shared a common structure. A godparent was expected to contribute to the child's dowry or professional establishment. They were expected to provide for the child if the parents died. They were often the first creditor a family could approach in hardship, and the interest rates they charged, when they charged any at all, were regulated by community expectation rather than by a financial institution. In Venice, the fraterna system extended this further. Brothers held property jointly rather than dividing it at inheritance. Godparent networks interlocked with fraternal networks to create webs of mutual obligations so dense that a single merchant family might have financial relationships with 30 or 40 other households simultaneously, none of which required a formal lending institution as intermediary. Historians who study medieval Venetian commerce note something that doesn't fit the standard narrative of economic development. Venice was the most commercially sophisticated economy in Europe for 3 centuries. Its merchants operated across the Mediterranean, into Asia, throughout northern Europe. They managed complex credit instruments, letters of exchange, partnerships with investors they had never met. And they did this before the development of modern banking institutions. Not because they were primitive. Because they had built something else. The Commenda contract, which historians generally cite as the origin of the modern investment partnership, grew directly out of godparent networks. A sleeping investor would entrust capital to a traveling merchant. The traveling merchant would use it and return with profit. The split was typically 3/4 to the investor, 1/4 to the merchant, for bearing the physical risk of the journey. What the textbooks don't emphasize is who those sleeping investors were in the early period.
They were godparents. They were compadres.
The formal commercial instrument emerged from the informal kinship obligation, not the other way around. I need to be honest about where this evidence is soft. The claim that the Council of Trent deliberately targeted the economic function of godparenthood is not in the historical record. The delegates were arguing about theology. They probably were not sitting in Trent thinking about how to create dependency on banking institutions 3 centuries later. But the effect is documented. The mechanism by which kinship-based credit networks were replaced by institutional lending is documented. The timeline of that replacement is documented. And the people who lived through it noticed. The records of the Rochdale pioneers, the English weavers who founded the first formal cooperative in 1844, are explicit about what they were trying to recreate. They had watched the guild system destroyed. They had watched the mutual aid societies undermined. They were trying to rebuild, using formal institutional structures, the functions that informal kinship networks used to perform. Their original rules read like an attempt to codify obligations that previously required no codification because they were embedded in social relationships. The cooperative movement is, among other things, a written-down version of what godparent networks did without writing. And here is what I keep returning to. In the regions of Southern Europe and Latin America where the compadrazgo system survived longest, historians document specific economic behaviors that distinguish those communities from their neighbors. Credit flows more freely between households. Catastrophic events, medical emergencies, crop failures, fire, are absorbed more effectively because the cost is distributed across a wider network. Families accumulate less formal debt because they have access to informal credit that does not require an institutional intermediary. These are not mystical properties. They are the mechanical outputs of a system that distributes risk across a network of people who are obligated to each other by something stronger than a signed contract. They are obligated by kinship, even fictional kinship created at a baptismal font rather than inherited through blood. The Mexican anthropologist Larissa Lomnitz spent 20 years studying kinship networks in urban slums outside Mexico City. Her 1977 book, Networks and Marginality, documented how families with no formal economic resources survived and sometimes thrived through networks of reciprocal exchange. Food, labor, childcare, money, all moved through these networks without formal accounting. The people inside them did not experience this as charity. They experienced it as the normal functioning of social life. Lomnitz noted something her colleagues found uncomfortable. These networks were more efficient at distributing resources to the people who needed them than the formal welfare institutions that nominally served the same population. Not because they had more resources. Because they had better information. The people inside a kinship network know who is suffering and what they need. A government institution issues forms. The godparent system is one of the mechanisms by which those networks were formalized and extended beyond blood relationship. If you and I are not related by blood but our families are bound by godparenthood, we are obligated to each other in a way that a stranger cannot claim. That obligation makes the network bigger. A bigger network distributes risk across more people. More people means more resources available when someone needs help. This is not complicated. It is, in fact, the basic logic behind insurance. Every insurance system is trying to recreate what kinship networks do naturally. The difference is that insurance companies extract profit from the arrangement. Kinship networks do not. The question is not whether the system worked. The evidence that it worked is extensive and well documented across multiple academic disciplines, from medieval economic history to mid-20th century anthropology to contemporary development economics. The question is why we stopped talking about it as a system. Why it became sentiment instead of structure. Why the word compadre still exists in English, borrowed from Spanish, but now means nothing more than buddy or pal. The silver cup is still given. The ceremony still happens. The godfather still stands at the font and promises to guide the child's spiritual development. But the land transfer is gone. The enforceable obligation is gone. The credit relationship is gone. The insurance function is gone. What replaced them charges interest. In 2008, The American financial system collapsed because of instruments so complex that the people selling them did not fully understand what they were selling. The crisis spread through institutional connections that nobody had mapped completely. Millions of families lost homes they had borrowed money to buy, on land they could not develop without borrowing money, in a system that had been built on the premise that institutional credit was a more rational foundation for economic life than the informal kinship obligations it replaced. The families who lost those homes did not, for the most part, have godparent networks that could absorb the shock. They had nuclear families and bank accounts and credit cards. Small units, isolated from each other, each one entirely dependent on institutions that had no obligation to them beyond the terms of a signed contract. I am not arguing that returning to a baptismal font credit system would have prevented the 2008 crisis. The world is larger and more complex than medieval Venice, and I am not romantically naive about what the old system excluded and who it hurt. But I am asking a different question. When we stripped the legal substance from godparenthood, when we turned the co-parent into a ceremonial witness, when we replaced the compadrazgo with a bank loan, what exactly did we gain? We gained institutions that could scale. We gained credit that could cross kinship lines, that could reach strangers, that could finance ventures too large for any single network. And we gained something else too. We gained dependency. We gained the position where every function the kinship network used to perform now required an institution in the middle, extracting a fee for standing there. I keep thinking about that Sicilian land transfer from 1891.
2 men, a piece of farmland, a debt cancelled. No bank. No interest.
No institution extracting a percentage for facilitating the transaction. The debt had existed for 11 years. It had been held in memory and in social obligation. When it was settled cleanly, between two people who had stood together at a baptismal font and made promises they actually kept. The document my grandmother kept in that wooden box was not evidence of a primitive system that progress replaced. It was a receipt from a system that worked, issued the decade before that system was methodically dismantled and replaced with something that worked better for institutions than it did for the people inside them.
The godparent still stands at the font. The promise is still made.
The silver cup is still given. But nobody is transferring land anymore.
And we call that progress.